Jack, let's turn ourselves off.
Yeah.
Klaudia, we'll tell you when to start in the chat.
Live stream on, you can start. I send you the link.
Okay, can I go now or?
Wait, give us 2 seconds.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the debriefing for round 3 of Belgrade Worlds. I want to give a couple of disclaimers before I will jump in. First of all, I will outline in general what could be potential clashes, what are like some advice how to debate that sort of motions. Even if you run this in your room and maybe it wasn't successful, that doesn't mean that necessarily it was like a bad case or your judge was wrong. It just all depends on like the comparative, how the other teams responded, how well that the argument was developed, how well it was explained, the weighing in the debate. So just to start with the wording and what the motion suggests to the teams to do, this house believes that the LGBTQ plus movement in developing countries should integrate patriotism into their messaging. So first of all, of course, we have a developing countries, so presumably you want to give some level of characterization, but you also want to remember that this exists on the spectrum. So presumably you want to try to give the characterization which will be familiar and similar to majority of the developing countries, or if you are giving some more extreme characterization, you want to frame it and explain why it will be the most meaningful part of the debate, or why we should prioritize that sort of characterization, why there will be the biggest change, or why there are like the regions which necessarily need this, or why there will be the regions which they will have the biggest amount of like responsiveness, neither positive or the negative. The second thing, which I think is extremely important in this debate, specifically from the government perspective, it's how this message will be exactly integrated, and to some extent, why you will do this properly, why you will do this in a smart way, and where this will be occurring, in which spaces. For example, will you need some resources to do this? Will you like collaborating this in some like political parties when they also have like representatives from like the social movements? You will be doing that maybe slowly, maybe in a soft way, or you will be doing that immediately, like, you know, combining all of the symbols. I think the way how you will structure this, it's dependent how people will receive this message. If this will be persuasive message, or if it will be extremely unpersuasive message. So if you want to run this from the government perspective, it's important to say exactly in which instances that will be working, to who you will be appealing your message, and what are the groups of people who maybe you are unable to convince on either side of the house to join on your board. So for example, if the opposition is saying about like there being massive like opposition towards this, that there are a lot of like extreme nationalist groups who will not accept you, who will be feeling like threatened, you might try to say that these things will remain the same on both sides of the house, that you will never convince them, but maybe there is a different group of people which you can approach. Or maybe you can aim for like the spectrum benefits that will maybe increase some level of like your bargaining power when you're looking for like some level of coalitions, when maybe you are trying to avoid the potential backlash which people might present you are having the opposite values. Sometimes you don't need to win like the massive amount of benefits in the instance or like change the world or create the revolution, but maybe something which gave some people some solace on the ground specifically. And then I think it's important which groups of people are you prioritizing and how big these groups are. So for example, if you want to say on the government side that there are a lot of people who might be progressive, that there are a lot of people who might share the values of patriotism, then you probably need to argue why these people are the most important for the movement, why they are like the vital power, and why they are likely to support your messaging and advocating for this. On the upside, presumably, you want to say that if people are so progressive and that people are not associated with the state and they don't want to be connected to the patriotism and the nationalism, maybe they will disengage from your movement and what they will go. However, in every time when you are analyzing this, it's important what is the outcome of this, or what are like the tangible benefits or tangible harms which this narrative will create. So for example, if you are the queer advocate and if you are seeing that your movement is becoming a little bit more patriotic or like integrating this messaging into you, presumably the question is, will you still remain in this movement even if dissatisfied? Maybe you will be less engaged, but it doesn't mean that you will be actively opposing them. Or maybe on the other side, you disengage completely, you will not want to associate, you will feel betrayed to some extent. And the question is probably which incentives are stronger, but also which group of people which will go either direction, what's the size of them? Because I feel in this debate, it's extremely important to be quite specific and not putting the people it's like white identity, who are they? So for example, on government side, if you have a people who might have shared identity, who might feel that they want to be patriotic, or maybe you want to encourage them to be a little bit more moderate, right? So maybe supporting some level of family values as well, maybe also still embracing their queerness, how you can try to find some level of consensus, but then you also need to mechanize this in terms of what it's realistically for you to achieve, how the people will be reacting. Then presumably you're also discussing some level of safe spaces, how you feel when you are going for the Pride March, and then you are seeing there, for example, the flags of the country which you felt like oppressed, or maybe it's better because if people will seeing you on the street, the people who are usually like the moderate will not feel that they can attack you for not supporting some other values and trying to combine the levels of narrative. It's extremely important in this debate to look for quantifying which group is probably the most powerful, which group is either the most vulnerable in the debate, either the most vocal one, and where you are capable to address the change from the people. Also, the examples in the info slide are not necessarily something which is the only thing which exists in the spectrum of this debate. The second thing which I want to talk, it's about some principal stuff, some the messaging, because probably this is not the only advocacy which you are doing as the LGBTQ movement, right? Probably you are also advocating still for like other things, you have the other issues to resolve. Will that narrative help you to share the broader message? Maybe include this in some of your other policies, or maybe on the opposite side, if you will stop criticizing the government, if you will stop being opposing, maybe it will also not necessarily give you the massive traction, or maybe you will not convince people to join on your board. This is additional clash which you are trying to explain what people might expect from you, not necessarily only about like the identity discussion. Will you be complementary? If the state usually putting you into boxes, or if you are supporting the nationalism, if your country it's against like the other country and you need to like go against them, how that will also affect the people buying into this narrative later in the long term, or how overall you will be consistent with the other messaging which you are doing. Then the question is this consistency even important? Because presumably you are trading off some level of values to get some level of the spectrum benefits. You are able to compromise things for the greater good, but it's also important to explain, right? Why, for example, you are capable to trade off this in order to gain broader like political support, or maybe to decrease the amount of resentment which some other people might have. But then also, if we think about this motion, there are also other groups which might be necessarily important to discuss in this particular debate, right? So maybe you are living in like a quite conservative community with a family, but they are not necessarily nationalist, or maybe they are not necessarily aware to which extent you are distinct with your identity as the LGBT person. Maybe it creates like the broader level of discussion, or maybe at least it mitigates the potential conflicts which might arise. For example, if we're using the military claim, maybe I'm different than like other things which we're seeing. Maybe I'm not seeing the person of the same gender. Maybe I don't want to get married. Maybe I'm opposing some other stuff. Maybe I'm dressing up differently, but I still have some stuff in common with you. I still have some shared values, which might be important for us, and how achieving the small benefits, maybe in the long run, creating like the better community, but also maybe on the even incremental, like the small level, how you are discussing with other people, how you are creating like the education and all of that. I think the important case, it's also about like the big events when that will be actually manifesting, which that might create like the media attention and the traction. You are getting much better defense when you are saying, look, at this moment, we are advocating for this part. This is something which have priority, which have the urgency for us. We are capable now to include the other things into the messaging, which will satisfy the different group of people. And then when you are asking the group, which is usually against you, they are losing some level of power to criticize you in some moments. I think as well, if you are talking about like the big events or like the big steps or like what you need to trade off, the question is, do you need to use additional resources in order to include this patriotism, in order to like collectivize with the other groups of people? Will you be welcomed by the nationalists? Will you be welcomed by the patriotists to some extent? And then again, it's a question, do we have a more moderate people who are able to be open, or who are able to become open, or they are not necessarily willing to do this? In the end of the day, the burden in this debate, it's show on which side of the house, which strategic message will probably be better. And then the question is as well, how to move forward and how to include like the other events which are happening irrespectively. Because if you're a social movement, presumably you are not in the position of power, and there are other people who already have this grounded, who already like coming from like privileged backgrounds, or like historical, like when it might be discussed in some rooms about like a post-conflict states where you have some level of elites which are unwilling to give up their power. But maybe if there is also like incremental change from the society, if there is like raising awareness, if there's like some societal shift coming even from like the West, but also like empowering people on the ground, maybe if you will suggest that this would be good strategy to include you, you also can guarantee the people in power that having you on board, it's also something meaningful. It's also something meaningful for them. In that case, this debate, it's quite broad if you look for the different groups of people which you can describe, right? But then you also need to characterize each of this group on a couple of levels. Presumably, what's the priorities and incentives of this group in the first place? Why these people join your group, or why these people would like to join your particular group and community? How this affect the people who doesn't have significant opinion in the first place? How it affects people on the extremes? And the question is, which of these people will be the most important for creating the message of the movement as a whole? Therefore, you need to think about as well what you will prioritize in this debate to some extent. It's very easily that 4 teams in this debate might have different metrics. Some teams might prioritize the safety. Some teams might prioritize representation, that we want to include more people. Sometimes these values are not necessarily going align with each other, right? Sometimes some people might say, yes, we maybe don't care about these people because they are little bit more privileged than our most vulnerable group. If you're already progressive, you are capable to stand out against like the people who are from like the different identities, who have like a different political views, then maybe you are more independent, and maybe we should prioritize people who will not be able to advocate for themselves alone. Then you can also, of course, from both sides, discuss about this in terms of maybe there are alternative ways to achieve your benefits without including the patriotic message. Maybe we can do this differently, or like align with the different groups. But if from the government side you are seeing that the situation currently it's quite bad and this is the way to improve, it's sometimes not enough for OP to say you will not achieve your benefits, but you also need to show what additional harms are happening on your side of the house in that in that particular case, in that particular regard. So let's look for potentially the Gulf line, what type of argument governments might run here. I think in terms of the getting some level of compromises or getting some level of allies which are not necessarily connected to the patriotism or nationalism heavily, but which also associate with this level of values. How you can also show that they shouldn't criticize you as a whole, as a movement, as an identity, because you are also willing to get some level of concessions, or you're also willing to not be radical, to not shit completely on all of the things which people are associated with. You can talk about the people who might feel splitted between the two identities and how you want to integrate them towards your message. You might talk about how it looked badly when you have like the division and you have two groups fighting against each other, and it's probably better to avoid the negative harms and taking down your events, or like not giving you permission to do something, or also people heavily feeling that you are not serious to some extent, or that you are creating some level of the strong messaging. Or maybe you also support some policies of the state, some policies of your country, some policies of your nation, but you don't want to seem too radical, and you don't want to simplify your messaging of being, if we are queer, we can't be together with the state. So maybe some level of narrative in that way. If you are on the upside, presumably you want to prioritize that your position and your bargaining power, it's very, very slow, that you are even enabling people to show that they don't want you sharing the values with them, that they maybe feel disconnected, and maybe they will be reacting more aggressively. Maybe you want to show that some people being within the LGBT community and the queer community don't want to associate themselves with the state, which might be also problematic for them. Maybe you want to show that it's decreasing your overall messaging towards the other things. So I think that's are like the potential things, the potential clashes which both teams will be talking about. I think in the end of each argument which you are making, I think it's important to show what's the comparative on the other side of the house, and trying to prioritize which things will be working in the particular moment, which things we can't change in this motion either way, but also how, for example, just making the step forward might create like a better perception for your movement. Second of all, I think in the end, when you are running this debate, you want to show why in this particular context of developing countries which we are characterizing, this is something which will have meaningful impact. So try to avoid situations when you are depicting the worst possible case scenario or the best possible case scenario, when there is like a lot of awareness, like people like you, a lot of progressivism, or maybe there is terrible, you are being suppressed. Because then you are risking that judge need to buy one particular characterization towards your case, and that will determine the call, or like how the round as a whole will be perceived. So I think the best way in trying to run that sort of motions, it's first to ask yourself the question, how this message will be delivered, and why this message will be perceived as effective one, to which extent people will associate with that, and to which group of people you're actually able to reach out and to get some level of hearing. The second of all, you also don't want to be vague in the characterization which you are making. When you are saying large movement, small movement, vocal people, people who don't have a say, people who will not join either way, sometimes there are also the movements in between, right? You maybe not join fully, but maybe you will express some level of sympathy. Maybe you will not completely shift towards like the queer policy, but maybe you will do something which will be at least like less antagonist towards yourself. So that sort of claims are extremely important, because then in the end of the debate, we are discussing on the margins when you are capable to achieve some level of change. But also, I think it's important to note, in many debates, people are saying, okay, you can't do this particular way because in other circumstances, we are also embracing this particular idea. The example of this is, you can say that every time when you are speaking on behalf of the group, you're always like generalizing them, you are showing their interest as the whole group. Therefore, it doesn't matter that we will do this with the patriotism and people will not be hurt. that doesn't also mean that this strategy was necessarily effective in the past or that the strategy was inherently good. So if you want to say that this argument doesn't matter because we are doing that either way, that doesn't necessarily mean that it completely rebut the argument from the other side or decrease the value per se. And I think, again, in this debate, it's extremely important in that sort of motions to be very detailed in terms of to what you are referring to and to what the actual mechanism or like the ability to trying to reach there. That being said, I hope you had fun debating this. I hope that like that this round was pleasant for you. If you have any questions to me, you can always reach me. But yeah, I hope it will be helpful for you and it showed you how the debate can be like played out from the both sides. And yeah, that would be all from me. Thank you so much for coming.